And yes, once again, welcome. This is the fifth event of Entangled Life, a series of events that is going to unravel different topics about art, environment, and community. Very diverse. You have in your folder the list of the events, so you will see that they are like quite diverse, but I believe relevant. Good space to a safe space to discuss about it and not just listen to someone talking. And today is intersectionality in art and climate, and we have great guests that have a lot to say, and I'm going to introduce them. I'm taking off my glasses because I cannot see with the glasses. And so in alphabetical order, we have Basil Al-Rawi, or Al-Rawi. Al-Rawi. Is an Irish-Iraqi visual artist working across photography, film, sculpture, and digital environments. His practice explores memory, hybrid identity, and the mediated structure through which histories are constructed. He is the founder of the Iraq Photo Archive and the VR project House of Memory, developed through his PhD at the Glasgow School of Art. His work has been shown internationally, including in the International Centre of Image, the Photographers Gallery, and the Lahore Biennale. He is the recipient of numerous bursaries and awards, including the inaugural Gibson Travelling Fellowship from the Crawford Art Gallery. Thank you. Carroll is a transdisciplinary artist with social practice, which takes form in performance, installation, and creative social spaces. Their practice rests upon the perception of the body impacted by socio-political narratives and its placement in society. During difficult times of embodied confliction, as a queer, non-binary disabled person, their community support them in creating new pathways of care. Tara is also a co-founder of the Chronic Collective with Onya O'Hara, and a multidisciplinary art collective with focus on radical accessibility and collective care in the arts. Recent awards include the Art Council Arts Participatory Bursary 23-24 in Temple Bar Gallery and Studios, Project Studios Award for the 2023. Projects and exhibition include Art as a Pilgrimage, 2022 and 25, the 84 Step of Solace in Planta Alta, Madrid, Discomfort in Planta Baja in Madrid in 2023, Seeking Solace in Temple Bar Gallery plus Studio. Thank you. And we have Vanessa Conroy, and is the project officer of Feminist Communities for Climate Justice as a joint project between the National Women's Council and Community Work Ireland, aiming to put a gender, feminist, and community work lens on climate justice. Previously, she worked as an occasional lecturer and academic tutor in Maynooth University's Department of Applied Social Studies, teaching on environmental policy, climate justice, intersectional environmentalism, and the connection between gender and climate crisis. In her MA research, in social science, rights, and social policy, was a feminist policy analysis of then current Climate Action Plan 2021, investigating whether Irish climate policy disproportionately disadvantaged Irish women compared to men. And Léann Herlihy, that I don't pronounce correctly, I'm apologizing, is an artist and research educator based in Dublin. Her practice is informed on trans, queer, ecological, feminist, and abolitionist theoretical frameworks, which deploy alternative modalities of expression through an array of medium, including live performance, video, billboard, sculpture, text, workshop, and radical pedagogies. Refusing disciplinary coherence, the research dwell in the often incompatible and unarchived fragments physically found in the back storage rooms of virtually spiraling down the thread of online forums as they scavenge for remnant of those who have been deliberately or accidentally excluded from society. Thank you very much for for coming. I have a question for each. This is how it's gonna be, and then you can think if you have more questions or anything. I will start with Vanessa, and I would ask you if you can explain what is intersectionality and what is in the context specifically in climate change, and what is your work about. Specifically, you recently published 2 toolkits, and if you want to talk about it. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm assuming this is how I'm holding this mic. But I would start by saying I think even at the heart of the work, before we introduce it, is kind of a concept that I consider like an intersection, in that we would consider in our own work climate justice to be the intersection of kind of climate change and social justice. And in our own work, we would use that as acknowledging the fact that those who have contributed the least to the greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere will be feeling the most of the impacts of climate change, but won't have the kind of the resources or the capacities to kind of respond, protect themselves, create adaptation strategies in their communities. And then in our own work, Feminist Communities for Climate Justice, and as was in my intro, is a joint piece between the National Women's Council of Ireland and Community Work Ireland, who are 2 all-island organisations, membership organisations made up of people advocating for women's rights, and then in Community Work Ireland, who are based in Galway, who work with community development workers and community education, and basically working with what we call underrepresented groups in our society, and really those groups who we think will be most impacted by climate change, and in particular government policy response to climate change and how the government considers our transition to kind of net zero, no emissions by 2050. So the project really came up as a response to members in both organisations. In the Women's Council, it's very recent work. We only started looking at climate really just before the COVID-19 pandemic. And we were mandated by our members to really investigate climate change as a feminist issue for its impacts on women and girls in our society. And then again, in an intersectional way, not seeing women as just one big group, but seeing traveller women, disabled women, women who are seeking asylum, and so on and so forth, and really trying to investigate the specific impacts for all kinds of women, and really recognizing that intersectionality has a really big impact on how you might experience environmental degradation, how you might adapt to environmental degradation, and what kind of actual resources from government are available to you as well. And for those in community work, Ireland working with kind of underrepresented communities across the country, they've been doing that work for more than 10 years in Ireland. They're kind of one of the first to really make that social justice connection to climate change in a domestic context. And what they found is that they're working with communities who are really fighting fires. They're trying to keep food on the table. They're trying to keep their lights on. They're trying to keep a roof over their head, and trying to talk to people about climate change on top of all of that. They really didn't want to hear about it. But also recognizing that climate change would hit these communities harder. They would have less resources to respond. They're less represented in decision making. They have less things like wealth and property and so on and so forth. But feeling entirely unable or unconfident in communicating that to these groups, and feeling like I have to know all the science, I have to know X, Y, Z, I need the degree. And really a huge piece of work of this project is just capacity building and education. The 2 toolkits we launched, I have them both here, but I'm not going to attempt to hold them both up with one hand because I know I'll clatter them to the ground. We basically made as resources for any kind of facilitator, really. People organising any kind of group, whether it is underrepresented communities or whether it's communities you want to bring into the climate conversation per se. Because it was really, when we put these toolkits together, it was so you didn't feel like you have to know all the science. And a huge piece of these is that we don't want you to know all the science. We want you to know the very basic piece about greenhouse gases, and then that's it. And we want you to be able to then use it to have conversations with people about topics in their day-to-day lives. And so a lot of the work we found working with communities across the country is that you need to talk about climate without using the word climate. For a lot of people, climate change, circular economy, anything like that, they're like, that's not a space for me. That's not something I need to be concerned with. That's the middle class space. It's like, for people living in the city centre who have access, to the electric vehicle charging, to the retrofitting, to heat pumps, and it's not something for me. So what we do in our work is that we really try to connect the climate crisis to the really topical issues of our time. We connect it to things like housing, particularly the housing crisis. Our rental housing stock is of really bad energy efficiency, quality, damp, mold, not keeping in heat. And a huge kind of climate justice issue there is that tenants aren't the ones who get to decide whether that property gets energy efficiency upgrades done on it. That's up to landlords. And then we have issues of, are tenants going to be evicted in order for these kind of energy efficiency upgrades to be carried out? Another example would be working with the traveller community, people who don't live in standard homes but are some of our most energy poor. They spend so much of their annual income trying to keep trailers or caravans warm, but there's no kind of schemes available from government to create more energy efficient caravans or even grants to purchase more energy efficient mobile homes. So these would be the kind of issues we're talking about. And then, for example, talking to rural communities about transport, and particularly for people with mobility impairments or disabled community trying to access public transport, the ever-present out-of-order lift signs scrolling across your train station, and buses that are step-only access, and even things like trying to get on a Dublin bus if there's somebody already in the wheelchair space or if there's somebody with a pram in that space. So it's these kinds of accessibility issues, and a piece for us is that we think the government's current approach is that it's really pay to play. If you can afford the electric vehicle, if you can afford to do the energy efficiency upgrades, then you can take part in the green transition. But for the majority of people in this country, that really isn't a reality. And so a great deal of the work is doing kind of work at the bottom in the grassroots and kind of at the top doing policy advocacy work with government. So we have a network within our project of about 160 members. And really what we're trying to do is create a space where the really super climate types, your academics, your kind of organizations like Friends of the Earth and the environmental pillar are in the same space as community groups on the ground. So like family resource centers, like community gardens, any kind of like community spaces, and that these groups are in the same space, peer sharing, peer learning from each other. Because there's a lot of kind of environmental groups for which getting down into the grassroots and talking to people and getting into local communities is something they don't do. And I think it's kind of key for us to kind of bring these groups together and to bring kind of people fighting for social justice and for equality into the same space as kind of the climate movement as well. Because ultimately, the approach that government is taking right now means that we get to 2030, 2050 with less emissions, but we have kind of just green inequalities. We have green sexism, green ableism, green classism. You have a cohort of people who are unable to participate because of financial burden. You have basically our current inequalities entrenched, but just with less carbon emissions attached to them. And that's why the intersectional approach is so important to us, to make sure that nobody is actually left behind in that transition, but also importantly, recognizing that there are a large cohort of people who have already been left behind. And how do we make sure that we actually take them with us?
Thank you. Talking about having perspective and understanding different perspective, I would like to bring to ask a question to Basil, and we are talking about exactly having an inclusive perspective. Mm-hmm. You bring a different perspective in your work, especially that it is quite important to have always this view that is this very local, but at the same time we are aware of what is happening around. And so my question would be, considering that your practice exactly explores memory, hybrid identities, and how the history is mediated through different structures. How do you see your archival projects, specifically the Iraq Photo Archive and the House of Memory? How the audience experience this history that are often marginalized, as in this case, and how these intersect, of course, with the environmental issues. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you can say something about your work.
Yes. Thank you, Christina, and thanks for that outline there, Vanessa. This is somewhat of a new territory for me. So this framework of intersectionality and your question and this prompt and this whole discussion prompted me to reflect on the work in a different way as well. And I'll try to maybe speak about that a little bit and unpack it a little bit, I think, through that lens, because it's not something that was maybe at the forefront of my mind initially when doing this work. So I think what I'll do is talk to you a little bit about the motivations behind the work, which I think sort of explain how it might feed into this discussion. So there's two works that you mentioned there, which is the Iraq Photo Archive, and then a subsequent work that was born out of that project called House of Memory, Beit al-Dhakara, which some of you may have encountered at the International Centre for the Image. It was showing there for the last 2 months. So that the origins of that project come from this space of I suppose, a space of marginalization with regard to representation. So as somebody growing up in Ireland, majority of my life growing up here, having a dual identity of being half Irish and half Iraqi, and having, living in both of these spaces, and also growing up as a Muslim in, 1980s Ireland, which was extremely kind of monocultural space to be in. That certainly a challenging space to be in, to be kind of navigating a lot of these territories. And Ireland has changed dramatically since that time, and it's certainly a lot more diverse. And dual and hybrid identities, whatever label you want to put onto them, are much more common. They're quite uncommon at that time, and so you tend to operate from a space of a performative identity, and also kind of putting on masks as well too, depending on the situation that you're in. So from that kind of background, a lot of my impressions of one part of my culture, the Iraqi side of my culture, were informed by a dichotomy of sources. So you have, on the one hand, personal, familial, cultural aspects, which are related to my family, that are in the home, and they're related to food and to music and to language and religion and many other things. And then you have a media landscape that presents another view or another kind of lens on this experience. And so the archive, to fast forward, was born from that space of frustration, from seeing certain kind of representation of culture and demographic and people through newsprint media, TV news, with Iraq represented as Iraq and the broader kind of Southwest Asia represented as a landscape of perpetual violence, and these kind of ideas were perpetuated through films, through the actual conflicts taking place, but also through video games, which I was playing a lot as a kid. So seeing all of these, this kind of media landscape, and then seeing the kind of images that were in my father's personal archive, and the stories that were associated with them and that we kind of shared within the home, led me to this idea of, I suppose, the power of the vernacular archive and the power of the personal in trying to challenge the kind of dominant messaging and the dominant representation of this particular people and culture. And this is kind of replicated for many other peoples and cultures, but I can speak just to that context from Iraq. And so the idea was simple, really, which was to start with a photograph. And the archive began with photos from my father's personal collection. And it's not an archive, it's just a family album that was on his shelf, which, I kept on perusing and asking him questions about, because it was, it was a fascinating thing to see my father as a young person. When I was growing up, it was a curiosity. And it obviously represents a very different side of the country and its people and its culture. Because it's just photos of everyday things. Yeah, it's like people at graduation events, field days at college, usually kind of special events, special occasions, which is when people used to take pictures. Yeah, it was usually only at a special occasion. So you didn't have phones. Yeah, and you take one picture. Yeah. So it began with those images and a prompt to Iraqis in the diaspora, because that was my frame of reference. It wasn't this, broad stroke that I was trying to paint, but it was really just the people who were also in this diasporic situation, to also share images from their own personal collections and to share the stories associated with those images. And through that, to try to create a space of representation that was built from authentic personal narrative and memory, and not from any kind of imposed narratives, because that was, part of the issues with misrepresentation. And much of what's happening in our world today is born out of this. It's born out of decades of misrepresentation, and a lot of it's through various different layers of whether it's entertainment media or news media or various other kind of discourses that are imposed from the outside onto a group of people. So that the invitation was put out there, and people contributed to this. So it's a website. It's an online community sourced repository of images. So it's just a space that was created. And I think that's kind of important to think about too, is this idea of creating a space where people can relate. And it was a space that I maybe rather selfishly wanted to create for myself, because I didn't see that space anywhere, and it was hard to kind of find that space. So all I did was maybe just create the space, and it has been populated by the photos and the stories. And the next layer then was to try to mediate that in some way, because those kind of structures of control and oppression are mediated through various different forms, usually of entertainment media. And video games was a key thing for me, because the kind of one way that the misrepresentation of the Arab world and Arab culture has been perpetuated has been through video games. And it gets people very young, and it gets people into this idea that it's all you do there is bomb it, and that's how you win the game. You will be successful, you get to the next level if you kill and you destroy. And that was my personal experience. I mean, the games were fun, and I played them, but it's a really strange situation to be in, to be playing these games that are, contextualized around bombing your country or part of one part of your culture. It's a really weird space to be in as a child, but all your friends are playing it, so you're like, oh, cool, I'm gonna play this too. And so I was very interested in that technology and how it's so implicated in, kind of systems of control and oppression, and military. And so using virtual reality, I won't go too deep into that, but the reason why I used virtual reality to reconstruct these memories was to sort of use the systems of control and kind of appropriate them and subvert them a little bit, and to use the language and the materiality of a video game environment that's normally used to construct a site of conflict for entertainment and to gamify trauma, but rather than to use it for that context, to use it for having a relational and intimate encounter with somebody's personal memory, so that you can sit for a few minutes and listen to somebody tell not their life story, but literally just relay a short memory of eating breakfast under a tree with their family, for example. So that is an experience that is universal. A lot of people, not all of us do, but most people are lucky enough to have a breakfast every morning with their family, let's say. And another story is of, and what was interesting, in bringing back this idea of how it relates to climate and environment, what I was reflecting on when I interviewed a lot of people who, part of the, I'm kind of meandering here, but excuse me, part of the invitation on the website to share your photos was also, are you open to have an interview and have a conversation? And so what you get on the surface of these photos that are submitted is something denotational. It's usually a description of, this is me in 1974 at Habania Lake. And then when you have a conversation with somebody about that for an hour, you get so much more than what's just represented. And it's one way of kind of thinking about the personal archive as this huge resource for drawing out kind of personal narrative and experience and creating a site of collective memory and sites of connection, which are quite human, and they kind of connect people across kind of cultural and national boundaries as well. But one of the things that came out from these conversations and sitting to people and talking to them, it was a lot of it happened on Zoom because of that pandemic. They spoke a lot about being in the landscape. So a lot of the things that were happening, a lot of the memories were to do with being on field trips by the lake, or going outside of Baghdad to Tarmiya, which is an area that's full of palm groves, like that, having breakfast outside under the palm tree, or visiting different places like the marshes, the Al-Rawi, which is an incredible UNESCO World Heritage Site in Iraq, and we all probably know it from the news how it was drained, and then but it's also it's a space that you can't maybe go back to now. So some of those things that they related to in relation to landscape and place and environment are lost because of conflict, environmental catastrophe. And a more kind of broad, larger stroke, Iraq is kind of a microcosm for all of these issues. It's a condensation of geopolitics, ecocide, environmental catastrophe, exploitation of resources. It's got the whole thing. And so anyway, that's kind of some of the things that kind of surface from thinking about the conversations with people. But just to kind of, in summation, the project was really about creating a space for people to have an encounter with personal memory with a group that has been a group of people or an identity or a culture that has been marginalized, but also has been dehumanized and sort of flattened into a very kind of one-dimensional perspective through various forms of media.
That's very. I think it's very important to, relate to other people, to this base, commonality of experience, and it's very interesting the fact that these experiences are usually connected with the environment in which they were. Somehow there is like a duality of this. And talking about having understanding of other people's experience and creating a space to feel somehow safe, I would like to ask a question to Tara, if it's okay.
Yeah.
And
can I click this? I have too much stuff on me.
And talking about exactly this common experience or understanding.
Yep.
I had a question, but I'm going to change it a little bit. Same question.
Yeah, no worries.
Your work emerged from embodied experience, queerness, disability, collective care in this case. So resisting also social pressure. How can this perspective inform our understanding of vulnerability and resilience, specifically in this context of climate crisis?
Yeah.
And in your case, how might participatory and socially engaged practices can be supporting one another?
Yeah. So hi, I'm Tara Carroll. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a queer non-binary disabled artist, and I work with a lot with different communities, and the space I come from in terms of working is through like disability justice and collective care. And your question, about like collective care, and if people who don't know what collective care is about moving away from like a westernized idea of individualistic, like self-care, and responsibility of the self, that our complex and nuanced needs are more shifting to true community and true collective action, and especially in the face of oppressive systems like white supremacy, anti-capitalism, or capitalism, and that we aren't in the positions we are in just because of our own actions, but because of these multiplicities of actions from oppressive systems. And that's where collective care comes in, because in particularly for disabled communities, and also for the trans and queer communities, that our bodies already act in resistance towards capitalism and white supremacy, and we are so creative in our solutions of how we survive this shitty society. Just going to say it plainly. So we are the people that should be forefront in the solutions of climate change. And we should be the main people of consultation. We should be, because we are so creative and adapting in our environments with resilience, and also the disability communities. We are the most impacted by climate change. We're the most that are forgotten about. We are the most infected, like in terms of even like COVID. Like we are still in a pandemic, just to say, and to say that things like that back down, or that pandemic, or this, that, and other. We are currently still in a pandemic, and there are still currently people dying, and predominantly the disabled communities are dying. And why we shift into a new normal, that people like to, we already had amazing solutions to a lot of things that arrived through in between lockdowns, and like collective care, community, that all these things that came into fruition through the beginnings of the pandemic. And now there's a conscious choice to forget about these things. There's a conscious choice to forget about masking. There's a conscious choice in forgetting about collective care and community care, and going back into driven back into capitalism of fast pace. And it's all about, like, we seen evidence through the beginning of the pandemic, is that the slowness has actually had such an impact for climate action, that climate change did slow down in a lot of ways, because that we had to slow down as a society. And so when we talk about like slowness and slowness, it's like disabled people have to fight against how productivity and capitalism, how we work. So if we look to these communities, we can go, well, there's solutions here already, the same as within, there's so many solutions within already the queer, the trans, the Black, Indigenous, people of colour communities. Like, they aren't the people who are pushing forward climate change. There's already things in place that we can look to these communities. I'm just going to get my notes because I'm getting a bit of brain fog here. 1 sec. So in terms of like, when I talk about consultation with disability communities, it's because we are constantly left behind. There's a really big example, if anyone's from the disability community here will know, a prime example of eco-ableism is the plastic straw ban. So the plastic straw was actually invented for disabled people. And it's for people who have less mobility in their arms or neck. And the bendy straw, to have access to that into spaces, is very important to a lot of people's survival and access to a human right of being able to hydrate themselves. But then the plastic straw ban meant that you were no longer able to access this accessibility tool. And again, was driven by this, this is just driven of like consumerism, that we think we're going to buy ourselves out of climate change as well. But also that like there is tools in place that were for certain groups of people who are most affected by climate change. And now they are the people who are now getting even more denied of their rights because of the lack of consultation between communities. And just thinking that this is a blanket choice that will benefit everyone when that is not the case. So when we look at changes that are happening, we need to also like the people who are like what Vanessa was saying, like forgotten about, like they should be the people who are at the forefront of these things, because it's all also about bringing back to collective action and community. Yes, it's so easy to say like, buy your beeswrap for this, like for your Tupperware or this, that, another. But like to have access to these things is also a privilege. And there's like a lot within the disability community who have what people see as waste because of like extra medical things that have also produce a lot of plastic and all these things that it should be this shift of the other people within communities to counteract that like production of waste that can come from being disabled as well, and that like the charging of medical devices, the charging of mobility devices, and like all these things have to be talked about as well, and that there is people who, to order to survive, also has a level of waste or extra use of energy, that how can we still allow the most vulnerable people in our society to survive in in these oppressive systems that, you know, that it doesn't put shame or guilt onto the most vulnerable people in our society as well. And then in terms of like the work that I do, is to like look again to collective care and collective action, and that it's not about individualism. And I create spaces where we can bring people safely together, and in terms like all of our events are masked because of harm reduction for community care, because we shouldn't be leaving arts events with being more harmed than when we entered this space. Like the risk of me being in this space with you is really drastic, and that's what's forgotten about constantly. Is like we all think about ourselves and what's comfortable for ourselves and getting back to new normals, but it's actually like, how can we do to make sure that people can access spaces and access culture and access the arts? Because when we come, when we be able to access that, that means there's so much more space to see each other and so much for growth. And then in terms of, I have other notes, and then that's it, and I will find. Yeah, because also like, yeah, okay, I think that's all I can say right now. Also, okay. Like, yeah, because also like when we talk about climate change, like even like the intersectionality of the anti-immigration movement that's skyrocketing here, like the anti-trans rights, everything that is happening, it's all intersectional in of like how we can better support each other. Because like climate action isn't just about like how to reduce down your waste, it's also about how we can actually care for the most vulnerable people in our society, and that's also enough for like climate action as well. And then when we think of Palestine and Congo and like all these things that are happening around the world because of and wars around resources, like we are driving that as a society, and we are causing these mass migrations and all the things that are happening. So if we slow down our production, or slow down of having a simpler life and the less need for devices and this, that, and other, it can have intersectional like impact across the world. But yeah.
Yes, definitely. Climate action should follow the just transition.
Yeah, and like when you're saying about like right now in the arts, I think participatory art is so important right now, because we should be learning from each other firsthand and like connecting with each other, because we're living in a society that's just driven of like being so small within this box of our phone, with this, that, and other. And then when you have participatory like events and art to access, that means our world is instantly opened up and seeing that we're bigger than just ourselves. And I think right now it's the most important art form that we need right now. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's space for everybody.
Yeah.
Yes. Exactly, talking about marginalization, different identity, not considered or included.
Oh, sorry.
Your work.
I forgot this is on me.
Oh God, I should have had it. I haven't asked the question. Nobody heard my questions. Okay. But they heard the answer, so that was the most important thing. So your work explores queer and trans experiences and highlighting identities that are often marginalized and overlooked. So I would like to know what is your perspective and opinions and experience regarding the social vulnerabilities highlighted by the concept of intersectionality that we were talking about, or just transition in this more defined and deeper sense, and the various challenges, for example, like housing, healthcare, as Tara was mentioning, and how does your practice relate to them? And if you can talk about your work as well. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Hey, my name is Léann Herlihy. My pronouns are they, them. And thanks to Vanessa, Basil, and Tara for talking. I'm the last person, which is kind of great, so I can kind of like actually pull from everything you've said. So I've taken some notes to kind of relate back to your like trajectories and stuff. But yeah, I'm gonna kind of try to actually walk us through like a line of thought to kind of open our ways of thinking rather than kind of present this as like my approach to this. Well, I will actually start with an approach when I normally start interest in anything. I actually conversely go quite to the fundamentals and I break things down to what the fundamentals are. When I like to think of climate action and climate change and queer ecologies and different forms of ecologies, I actually first entered that through my own upbringing in a rural area. So I had a very close relationship with nature and ecologies. So I started thinking, what's the kind of the first root of climate ecologies? And I started listing my own relationships to that. And the number one term that came up was nature or natural. And I think that that's something that can relate to what all three speakers have said. So I'm going to talk a bit about how the terms natural and unnatural have been used as weaponizing discourse on society right now. But I'm going to break down first how we got there. So first, I always like to think of like, no one has to answer this, maybe just have a thought. When we think of nature, who is allowed to be there? Who has access to that space? When we think of mainstream media, like Basil was saying regarding like video games and stuff like that, I think mainstream media as an educational tool is excellent because it's a bridging point for people to get some sort of like access, you know, and there's a way of bringing in like high theory and low theory in like a really lovely way. So I think from my experience of mainstream media and nature, within nature documentaries, except for one, Naked and Afraid is the only one that doesn't have this. There's one cohort that is a narrator throughout the whole thing. It's white, cis, heterosexual men who have full access to nature. And the discourse that is fed to us through mainstream media. There's a really amazing Indigenous environmentalist, May Evans, who does a lot of discourse regarding how she's kind of like a saucy output in her tone of like writing, speaking of white cis heterosexual men feeling at one with nature, whereas queer, trans, and people of color being afraid of encountering a white cis heterosexual man in nature. And I think that is a really excellent discourse for this. So regarding the queer and trans community, I'm going to kind of like start historically, not too far back. So the term of natural and being considered as unnatural, we can originate that queer, and I'm going to assume that most dominant understandings of queer always catapult trans in it. I don't think that they're interconnected. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But I would say a lot of transphobic people and homophobic people think that they are one thing together. So we can assume that they kind of put this policy into place. It originated in the US. We had our own one in 1533 in Ireland under the British Empire called the Crimes Against Nature Act. That was an act that made it illegal to encounter into same-gender sexual activity. Immediately, that sent to the forefront of the language that's being used, that we are considered unnatural. What is an unnatural sexual activity? What is this then kind of, it was within Ireland, it was called the Buggery Act, and kind of actually gatewayed it into like a particularly same-gender sexual activity between men, and like bestiality is the same. They were considered the exact same, which I think is a really, oh sorry, I've been clapping holding this, which I think is a really interesting thing when we think of like animality, when we think of nature as anyone who's kind of into the human, non-human and stuff like that, and the representation of gay sex actually in mainstream media, I think is really interesting when we think of Crimes Against Nature Act. So when we situate that, we see that that was something that has, you know, it was instilled, I think, in Ireland in 1533. It was actually only taken down from Ireland in 1994, maybe 97. I can't remember. 94, I think it was. Crimes Against Nature Act is still instilled in some states in the US. You know, some of our like favorite lesbian writers have written a lot of poetry regarding the Crimes Against Nature Act and losing access to their children as a result of this. So it's still very alive, it's still kicking. And I think, so that's kind of the first entry point of thought of like thinking about language and how that could have a form of ecofascism, eco-ableism 100% as well when we think of eugenics. Yeah. I think there's such a strong lineage of that. And then kind of within that, then we move to this idea of queer and trans people within, where do we normally reside within an island of Ireland, for example. I think this also actually translates a lot within like immigration as well and how this is used. It's predominantly in cities. It's called metronormativity in regards to queer and trans people. That's Jack Halberstam coined the term. It's when a member of the queer community leaves a rural area or a natural landscape and migrates to an urban area with the belief that they will have liberation. Within ecofascism, pollution and homosexuality and the city has been so deeply rooted, and it's also a lot rooted with like anti-immigration, that there's this correlation between immigration and pollution and the city and these people occupying these spaces. So we're always in this mind that we don't actually consider this group of people to be in any way touch with nature, that we have no kind of like identifying core with this. I think something that is quite interesting is like disrupting this ideology of what is considered like the natural scheme of society. What is considered natural? There's some really interesting studies that have been really pushed since 2007 onwards in regards to like the correlation of pollution with intersex people. That's been done a lot on like frog species. That has very kind of transphobic, very pushing that this is a bad result to happen. This is very bad, that correlating that to be intersex is bad, which is completely disproportionate to the life of an intersex person, which can be to the greatest liberation if there was a healthcare system that would support them. I suppose then opening and segueing through that within my own kind of body of work. I think it's I first started actually working with this idea in my practice of ecologies in general in 2020. Yeah, in 2020, I started the research, 2019, doing a master's in gender studies. And I was really interested in actually the queer rural experience as someone who grew up in rural Ireland. And I was really interested in the terminology. Language for me is just like such an interesting way that it's used in such a dismissive way. And I was really drawn to the way that people would describe nature in rural areas as nowhere. I thought that was like a really strong way to position a piece of landscape as being in the middle of nowhere. And it was the only place I wanted to be. But within kind of dominant understandings of the term, it was considered as like culturally redundant. There was nothing there. Like, you don't want to be there. The dictionary of it is like far from towns, etc. And I think that's interesting in that moment of like the etc. of like dictionary or any sort of authorship. When someone writes the term etc., it's a term for me that is open for you as the reader to annex your own understanding of what this case, the middle of nowhere, might mean. So I started entering through etc. and saying what the middle of nowhere is to me. And I, over the course of 3 years, was kind of building this research, looking into actually the transformative potential of when I was a young person. The middle of nowhere was actually where I accessed sex. Like, it was the space that no one was, that you would actively seek out. And it was very actually in the middle of cow fields, or like the bachelor caravans that a lot of people who do like milking relief come and do that. It was great. It was a wonderful space, a lot of transformative potential. And I started exploring that actually through like nature documentaries. I started becoming really interested in nature documentaries. I always have been. Like, David Attenborough is like my like last death call if I ever have a chance. Like, always has been, always will be. But I started going kind of and broadening it out, and I was looking into survival documentaries, like nature survival documentaries. Naked and Afraid was one of the main ones, and Bear Grylls, and all these other kind of different sort of mainstream media iterations where you're given in this idea of survival, where survival is always put against nature. It's never actually in harmony with nature in these shows. The individual enters the space to dominate the space. The terminology, like transcribing these shows, one of the most enjoyable things you could do. And like the language that they're using is we have heard so much about like the feminization of land, of earth and stuff like that, and how that rhetoric is used on nature throughout these shows. So I was working with creating like a mockumentary, like a documentary survival show. It was like 40 minutes long, where it was like me dropped off on the side of a mountain for a week, and I like camped there and was filming. Where I worked with a lot of different things, such as like I had been working with a sex shop in Berlin that works with this really amazing carpenter who makes dildos from like apple trees. And I was looking at, is this a natural form of sex? Because this is nature. Like, what is considered an unnatural form of sex? And then going into, like really being tongue in cheek with it and pushing this idea of it. So the film itself is like quite funny. But I think it was an attempt of me at trying to access this really heavy material in a way that, hopefully actually this could bring something to the forefront for people. And then kind of moving on from it, it kind of looked into the idea of, there was a lot of different events and performances and like tattoos and billboards, and this idea of it moving in through all these different spaces. But it was really looking at the potential of nowhere being this subjective area for anyone to become. A person could be this, that it doesn't necessarily need to be a landscape, that a body can be a landscape. I think one thing, I might be out of time though, but there's something that I just like wanna, it was in the question that I wanna like maybe just address at the end, of like safe spaces and safety. I think it's really important actually, I think, to acknowledge safety. So we're seeing a lot within society now the term safety being used as a public outcry to put legislations and deportations against people. So I'm coming at safety from a different point. Rather than speaking of safe spaces, I'm more so thinking of how this is being used as a tool, as a weaponizing tool, to think of the safety of the general public. I think that it's something that I work a lot with in my work for the past 3 years, is this working with wrestling communities, queer and trans-led wrestling communities, around who has the right to defend themselves and how this has expanded over the last few years. And something that continuously comes up is safety. And that this term is now being used as a public outcry to deprive people the access to public space. And that in itself is unsafe. So I think that if we actually just go to the bare minimum right now and actually leave safe spaces, I think safe spaces are like a really actually charged term, and just thinking of calling out people who are saying that it's unsafe for other people to participate in society. We're seeing it a lot right now with trans women, and particularly their access to bathrooms and public spaces. We're seeing so much in regards to anti-immigration, the deportation of people, the attacks of people that we are seeing in Dublin, the Indian community in particular in Dublin, and this thing of it not being safe. So I think as a group here, since it came up in the question for me, I thought it was quite important to acknowledge it, that we should push more for actually thinking of the public domain as a safe space for everyone to engage with. Yeah.
Absolutely. And probably like it's somehow connecting in different ways with everything that has been done, creating communities where, you can feel and create this space for safety, or connecting with the memories of other people, regaining the safety to be with other people because you are related. And yes, regain the mindfulness of what we are doing, what are the